We come across that.
Fantastic snow crab.
That's that are in the, some of them aren't being looked at.
Thank you, Kathy. Are we sitting so way down? When we think of the Nova Scotia Lighthouse, we see a small white tower with a red lantern on a rugged coast, flashing its beacon to guide mariners along their way. Here's one of them, Neils Harbor Lighthouse, located on a headland at the entrance to Neils Harbor off the Cabot Trail in the eastern Cape Breton Highlands. This little wooden lighthouse, affectionately known as a pepper pot or pepper shaker light, was not the first style of lighthouse to be erected in Nova Scotia, nor was wood used as the primary building material at the start of lighting up the coast by lighthouse. In today's talk, the architecture of Nova Scotia lighthouses, we will consider the 6 building materials used in lighthouse construction. That is stone, wood, concrete, cast iron, fiberglass, and steel, and examine the various lighthouse styles that have evolved since the lighting of Nova Scotia's first lighthouse in 1736 at Fort Louisbourg by the French. The stone towers. If you took Canadian history in school, you will know that the French and English fought several wars during the 1700s to expand their land grab in North America. The French built the first lighthouse on what we now call Cape Breton outside of Fort Louisbourg in 1734, using coarse sandstone rubble that consisted of roughly shaped stones fitted to make level beds. And you can see a drawing of it on the left side of the slide. The French did not get to enjoy their lighthouse long, as it was heavily damaged and put out of action by the bombardment led by the British Navy in 1758. That same year, 1758, the British built a granite stone tower of their own on the western approach to the Halifax Harbor on Sambro Island. This tower stood 60 feet high, that's 18.2 meters, and to protect the granite, it was covered with wooden shingles painted white, not the best color to use in a snowy winter climate. Looking at the photo in the center of the slide, it certainly does not resemble the Sambro Island lighthouse we see today. The third stone lighthouse on the right, Cape Roseway, became operational in 1788, and that was the last lighthouse to be built with stone in Nova Scotia. Hold on, what about the original Major's Beach lighthouse seen on the left of the slide? Technically, we could include it as a stone tower, although it was not built as a lighthouse from the ground up, but was created by putting a lantern on top of an unused stone Martello tower in 1828. The only stone lighthouse to survive until today is Sambro Island Lighthouse, shown on the right. Its tower increased by 22 feet, 6.7 meters, in 1906, and whose shingles are now painted in alternate red and white horizontal bands. Not only is it the oldest operating lighthouse in Canada, but in all of North America. The wooden lighthouses. The early 1800s saw the start of lighthouses built entirely with wood. Why this change from stone? I suspect that the cost of importing stone from England and paying highly skilled masons made the Board of Works that were responsible for lighthouses at that time suggest to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to go with a new design better suited to the climate and benefiting from the use of local skills and cheaper materials. Wooden lighthouses were built starting in 1804 and continued on into the 1980s. Octagonal wooden towers. There were 27 octagonal or 8-sided wooden lighthouses built over the next 100 years, with one exception, Gabarus, which is in Cape Breton, being of a hexagonal or 6-sided shape. Most of these towers were tall so that their lights could be seen at great distances. If we look at the interior of Seal Island that was built in 1827, we can see the influence of shipbuilders. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. Oh yes, good. So looking at the photo on the right, we see large sturdy knees, similar to ship's knees, holding up the stairs and gallery. In the report done by the Federal Heritage Building Review Office in 1994, the assessor speaks to the fact that this lighthouse and its contemporaries set the pattern for similar inexpensive wooden navigational aids, which became the hallmark of the Canadian navigational system from this point well into the 20th century. When you think of the fire risk of building with wood and the amount of flammable fuel that must have been hauled up the stairs for lighting the lamp, it is amazing that we still have 4 tall wooden lighthouses standing today. Going from left to right, we can see Seal Island, Gabarus, Henry Island, and Peter Island that has a circular gallery instead of the usual multi-sided one. And the dates next to the names is the year that they were built. Lanterns on dwellings. There were 2 variations on this style. The first had a lantern projecting from the front of a building that also served as the lightkeeper's quarters. I called it the North Canso look, as this was the first place to use this style in 1842. No doubt the views were terrific from the windows, but being built on the edge of a cliff meant using guide wires to hold the structure together whenever the wind blew hard. We only have photos showing this variation. There's no sites to visit today, and as far as I know, not only in Nova Scotia and the rest of Canada. Lanterns on dwellings, on top of the roof. Then starting in the 1870s, the lantern was moved to the middle of the rooftop of a square right building that also served as the lightkeeper's quarters. On the left, you can see the blueprint for the Gilbert's Cove Lighthouse that shows its exterior and interior design, both spacious and comfortable compared to previous accommodation for lightkeepers and their families. It became a very popular style that lasted until the 1940s. Consequently, we have several fine examples around Nova Scotia today. On the right, you see Isaac's Harbor, Gilbert's Cove, Port Bickerton, and Queensport. Note that Gilbert's Cove and Port Bickerton are open to the public during the summer. Please visit our website or Facebook page for details. Pepper Shaker Towers with attached dwellings. Many of these were built on islands or in isolated areas, and therefore making it necessary to provide a house for the lightkeeper and his family. We are fortunate to have 2 books written by the wives of lightkeepers about living in this type of lighthouse pre-World War II. You will notice on the right side the interior layout of this combined lighthouse and dwelling is drawn by Maggie Boutelier in her book. It's interesting to see that the ladder to access the lamp room and lantern was installed in the boys' room. As light keeping for a particular lighthouse tended to pass from father to son, it may have been early training on the job to be woken up during the night by the regular lightkeeper. Evelyn Richardson, in her book, We Keep a Light, said, "The lighthouse tower, so many feet above the tops of the dwelling chimneys, affect both stoves. When the wind veers a few points east, flame and smoke billow out into the room, and we are forced to open both kitchen doors. Then, after flinging out the burning sticks from the stove out into the field, we take refuge in the living room until the worst is over." The kitchen was and is our poorest room. It was added to the original building as a summer kitchen and is 3 steps down below the level of the rest of the house. These steps, so often found in old houses, my grandmother called woman killers. The kitchen, exposed on 3 sides, is built directly on the ground and is bitterly cold in the winter. Whether it was this poor design that Evelyn described in her memoir, or the use of substandard materials, we only have photos of this type of lighthouse today. There's no sites to visit in Nova Scotia. There is one in PEI, however, it got affected by one of the storms that blew through, and I'm not sure that it's open again. Pepper Shaker Towers without attached dwellings. These lighthouses were built for the most part along the Nova Scotia coastline to mark safe entry into the fishing ports or small harbors. The lightkeeper was hired from the local population, and as he usually had his own house, there was no need to build an attached dwelling. There were some lightkeepers, though, that installed a bed to sleep over in times of storms. These towers are considered short if they are 1 to 2 stories high, like Walton Harbor on the left, and tall if they are 3 or more stories high, like Bacaro Point on the right. Many of these still dot the coastline today and saw their ownership transferred in the last 30 years from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to community groups such as a nonprofit society or a municipality or township. If an aid to navigation is still required and the lighthouse meets the health and safety standards of Coast Guard, then DFO can agree to continue to use it as an aid to navigation. The community group then looks after the tower structure while Coast Guard maintains the lighting mechanism. Many community groups open their lighthouse to the public during the months of July and August, such as Walton Harbor in East Hants, Spencer's Island, Port Gravel, and 5 island lighthouses along the Parsville shore, Margarettsville, and Hampton lighthouses along the Bombay shore. Church lighthouses. The lighthouse and lightkeeper's dwelling were combined so that the finished structure had the look of a traditional church. Note that the light tower took place of a steeple, and often guy wires were added to support the lantern top in areas of high winds. While this layout was very popular in the United States, there were only 6 built in Nova Scotia at Apple River, Bigelow Point, East Ironbound, Ingonish Island, Pugwash, and Stephen Point. Given the fact that all were built over 2 years, 1870 to 1871, this may have been a trial to see how this type of lighthouse withstood the powers of nature in Nova Scotia. That no more were built after this time suggests they were more high maintenance than other designs. Today, we are fortunate in having one such lighthouse left, and that's East Ironbound. The concrete towers. While the formula for reinforced concrete was developed by Joseph Monnier in 1849, it wasn't until the early 1900s that concrete reinforced buildings were built and gaining public acceptance as a new building material. The first two concrete towers built in Nova Scotia had 6 external ribs or buttresses as shown on the lighthouse on the right. These were Little Hope Island Lighthouse that you see, that was greatly damaged by Hurricane Juan in 2003, and Flint Island Lighthouse that was demolished in 1862 as salty ocean water had been used instead of fresh water to mix the mortar. This design was replaced with a new concrete version of the traditional octagonal wooden tower, and many of these can be seen today at Peggy's Point, what people call Peggy's Cove, Major's Beach, Western Head, Chebucto Head, and George's Island seen on the left of the slide. Starting in the 1950s, square-sided concrete towers were built as a corner of a square concrete building that housed foghorn equipment or a generator for power. As foghorns were discontinued and lights automated using solar panels, little effort and time was spent on maintaining the entire square building, and now often just the square-sided concrete tower remains on site. Point Prim on the left is an example of a complete structure, while Caribou Island on the right has only the tower remaining. The cast iron towers and their specific dates. While they were common abroad, there were only 2 erected in Nova Scotia. The first shown here was erected at Cape North in 1911 that had as its second lighthouse a repurposed cast iron tower that once stood at Cape Race, Newfoundland. The Cape North Tower, shown on the left in a black and white photo, has since been moved to Ottawa in 1980 and is now on display outside the Museum of Science and Technology. And that's something a lot of people don't understand, is that wooden and cast iron lighthouses were moved around. If they weren't needed in one place, they went to another. When a fire destroyed the wooden lighthouse at the southern end of St. Paul's Island in 1914, it was decided to use cast iron plates to erect a 23-foot high tower with a concrete gallery in 1960, and you can see it on the right. In spite of these precautions, Billy Budd spoke of a lantern fire in the 1950s in his book, Memoirs of a Lightkeeper's Son. While the tower was not destroyed, it was a family affair to get the revolving Fresnel lens back into operation, with Billy and his sister assigned to cleaning fire debris out of the mercury bath with their bare hands. The tower at St. Paul's was moved to the Coast Guard base on the Dartmouth waterfront in 1964 and remained there until it was repatriated in 2011 to Dingle, Nova Scotia, where it stands today in front of the St. Paul's Island Museum. The fiberglass towers. These lighthouses were unique in that each had a circular fiberglass tower topped by a lantern. No doubt it was a trial to see if using fiberglass would produce a fairly maintenance-free structure, as many lighthouses were soon to be automated and de-staffed. What no one thought of was exposure to high winds. At Whitehead Island, off the eastern shore, keeper Wilfred Conway reported that the tower shook so much that the beacon atop the tower sometimes made complete revolutions, even though it was not operating. 4 guy wires were run from the top of the tower to the ground in an attempt to brace the tower. 8 years later, the shaky tower that nobody wanted to climb was replaced by a concrete square tower on the corner of the existing Foghorn building. There were few fiberglass towers built, but you can still see one at Pubnico Harbor, northwest of Barrington on the Acadian shore, or from a distance on Green Island off Petit Grat in Cape Breton. the steel hybrid towers. Using the metal tower as a base shown on the left, there were several attempts to combine it with components such as an enclosed staircase and lantern to replace the more traditional looking lighthouses. One unique structure built in 1962 was the Pugwash Lighthouse, shown in the center of the slide, and it was demolished in 2023. As you can see, it looks as if the top of a pepper shaker tower has been welded to a steel tower that could also have served as the base for a fire lookout tower, once common in Canada. It would be interesting to know what led to this design, as there were no others like it in Nova Scotia. Another style seen on the right was an enclosed staircase surrounded by a skeleton metal tower that supported a gallery with or without a lantern. Given the fact that only 5 such towers were built, it was obviously not a popular design. Perhaps it had proved not to be as maintenance-free as the Department of Fisheries and Ocean hoped it would be, as none can be seen today. So, what is the design that has withstood the test of time and Nova Scotia weather? It is the little wooden standalone tower known as the pepper pot or pepper shaker light. Its simple structure can be easily maintained by local community groups and repurposed as a picnic park, a summer museum, or a lookout point. In addition, many are still used as aids to navigation in partnership with Canadian Coast Guard. A win-win solution for mariners and the preservation of lighthouse history for all Canadian citizens. And this brings me to the end of my talk on the architecture of Nova Scotia lighthouses, and I would be pleased to answer any questions or hear any comments you may have.
There was one of the styles that was the pepper pot with the dwelling attached to
Yes.
it. And there was none left, I think.
There's one, and I'm trying to think of the word. It's on the north shore of PEI. It starts with New something, and I don't want to say New Glasgow because it's not that. And they had used it as an ice cream candy shop, souvenir thing. And I guess it's been what, 2 years since we've had our last hurricane? And apparently there was a surge, and I guess they were at sea level, and it came into the lighthouse, and I understand that it moved it off its foundations, and I have no idea if they've taken the time to fix it up again. I'm sure they have. I've got to get Prince Edward Island credit. They are a small island, a small population, but they've done their darndest to keep their 33 lighthouses in good shape, because that's tourism dollars for them.
There's one down on the shore of St. Mary's Bay, and it's not.
Liscombe?
No, down on
PEI?
Around the Sonerville area, Church Point maybe, down that way, down on the French shore.
Okay.
There's it's a building that looks like it was a lighthouse, and it looks like it was a lighthouse. It's not being used as a lighthouse now. In fact, I'm not sure what's being used. It looks like a building's been renovated for some purpose. When I saw it a few years ago, it wasn't being used, it looks like, but it looks like it was an old lighthouse that was a dwelling with a pepper pot style in the front.
Yeah, it's quite possible, because prior to 2000, all lighthouses that were no longer needed were sold to the highest bidder. The condition was they had to move it away from its site.
Right.
So many of them became sheds, or as you say, buildings. There's one up in Canning we just went to look at last year, and it was a pepper pot, and it ended up as a pig shed. Then it got converted to a tourist center. There's something else it went into, and then finally they, using the local high school, they rebuilt, because it had been cut in half, they rebuilt the top. And now it's sitting behind, what is it, the Fieldwood Heritage Society Museum in Canning. and it has to move again.
Mm.
So we're hoping, there's a park just at the other end of town that it would be perfect to put it there. And that would be a safe place to park and walk right up to it and take photos, but
You're not familiar with the one I'm speaking of, though, down around Church Point?
no, I'm gonna have to look for it.
Okay.
Oh, I know that one,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
There was an actual, Church Point, lighthouse that looked somewhat like that. And if I remember correctly, it blew down during a storm. That's
Just a
not
couple of years
unusual.
ago.
Oh, is
Yeah.
that so?
Just a couple of years ago, they lost their lighthouse at Church
Yeah.
Point, yeah.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
what they did was the Acadian University built a facsimile, and it's a rather large scale facsimile. I don't find it, I went to see it, we went to see it 2 years ago delivering these maps. And I can't say, I mean, good information on the old one inside,
Yeah.
but it's also a birder center. Birder,
Yeah.
you know, people who like to look for birds, cause that whole area has got a lot of birds.
That's probably the one I've seen then. So it's a replica what's standing there now?
Well, replica, it's not the
Not
best
the-
replica I've seen,
sure,
but
it's
it's a
a-
facsimile, I'll
A
call it, yeah.
representation,
Yeah.
So now there's one too on, Bass River, that looks like a pepper pot that with a small dwelling attached to it.
Yes,
I don't know, and maybe you do, when this will, well, that's my
that was
question.
one of the ones that was sold prior to
It
2000,
was it?
and
So-
the person took it off and added a cottage to it.
Right, so the cottage that's there was not original?
No,
Oh, okay,
no.
thanks, that's, cheers.
Yeah, you'd be amazed how some of them, I call them 20-year wonders. You know, they were put in a small harbor, and then 20 years later, for some reason, I guess the business wasn't there anymore, they didn't fish out of that area much anymore. And so, unless it moved to another site, and lighthouses did move, especially of that type, it was sold to somebody local who
The
developed
history,
it as a cottage.
a lot of the small seaside communities was quite imperial at times, that, either fishing was peaks and troughs, then shipbuilding peaks and troughs, and, so many of these large communities barely exist today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are records of people floating lighthouses from New Brunswick over
Oh, no
to the
doubt.
north shore of Nova Scotia, you know, on the Fundy Bay, just
Mhm.
moving it across. And there was one built in Brooklyn, that's outside of Liverpool. It was the end of a long, long wharf. They put rocks in it to hold it down during a storm. Well, they had a hell of a storm. The wharf went out, but the lighthouse buoy was right on its little bit of wharf that was left. And they decided that they just weren't going to rebuild this wharf, because it was just costing them too much money. So they picked up the lighthouse and they took it down to Cape Sable Island, because you have the very tall Cape Sable Island, but they wanted one at the other end of the island. And that one went there, but again, with lack of maintenance, they tore it down or sold it, I'm not too sure which one, and now you have a modern aid, you know, which I mean is a beautiful steel post with a lamp on top. So, yeah, they do move around. So we were repurposing lighthouses before, you know, repurposing buildings became the thing to do. So,
Denise, I know we lost a lot of lighthouses through fire. Was there any lighthouses we lost through, you know, to the sea, I guess? Like, you know, it fallen into the sea because it was on the edge and nobody did nothing? Do you know?
yes, up in Ingonish,
Yeah.
Cape Breton, I believe, if Barry McDonald was here, he could speak to it.
Oh, okay.
I think that they had two lighthouses, because it was a fairly open bay, but they had sand spits, which isn't your most solid material. And during one of the storms, one of them was washed out. Not far, but it fell in the water and that was the end of it.
Pictou Harbor may have been as well, I think that one was lost to sea.
The one at Pictou Bar,
Yeah. I don't know.
okay, that was a fire in 2000.
Oh, it was a fire, was it?
In
Oh, it was.
2004, yeah.
I see.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing, like I said, given all the fuel they dragged up, you know, and all the, because they were all flammable things, all petrochemical, that they didn't burn any more than they did. In fact, some of the ones that burnt were hit by lightning, and I guess they didn't have lightning rods, or the lightning rods weren't wired correctly. And Pictou Bar was, they think, an electrical problem, but there were others like on Ile Haute, which is outside of Cape D'Or. That one was destroyed by lightning.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't burn quickly, but if you can't stop it, it's a gone building.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the firefighting potential at most of these remote locations with dismal events.
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems I have. I have a lot of tourism reaching out to me and they wanna get really up close to them. And I mean, as much as I hate directing people to Peggy's Point, cause it's really an overused tourist site, they can get up close to them. But most places, you're right, they are isolated, and if they're used by Coast Guard, they don't like them, people running around them. It is a liability. One that opens to the public, is Medway Head, out on the other side of Liverpool. And they really isolate it. You can't go out there with a trailer, but if you have a pickup truck or a car, you can. And they're very creative in how they're maintaining it, because it costs money. It's essentially a seasonal building. You have to pay insurance and lights and upkeep of the grounds. And they have partnered with Dalhousie University to measure wavelengths out there, like the height of the sea and stuff. So when the storm came through, and that's gotta be 3 years now, I forget which one that was that blew through, they got their shingles and siding off.
Okay.
And their Dalhousie University project was blown out to sea. They still had the monitoring equipment inside that was okay, but I understand everything was put back together fairly quickly. So, it's part of the reason why you don't see more lighthouses maintained, if you wanna put it in Nova Scotia. They're traditional aids to navigation, they're very expensive to maintain, and Coast Guard, which is owned by, or supervised by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, doesn't have the budget to keep them up. So it's easier just to put up a steel post with an airport beacon and ask community groups to look after their lighthouse. So right now we have about, I'd say, I call it 40, 40, and 40, the 340 rule. There's 40 that are looked after by local community groups, and this can include the municipality. The municipality of Digby has 4 or 5 of them. And then you have 40 that Coast Guard still wants to use. And then there's 40 that Coast Guard no longer wants, they're up on the block. I don't know what they're going to do, because they've been there now for 3 or 4 years and nobody's making a move to say, yeah, we'll look after it. And it's understandable, depending on the size and the material, it's not easy. And also, it's the access. This was one thing I think they did wrong. They said to community groups, you know, you can have the lighthouse and the land underneath it. They didn't necessarily guarantee the access to it. So you have a lot of private property owners around a lighthouse. Terrence Bay comes to mind, just outside of Halifax. The property owners do not want anybody accessing it, even just going up the property boundary. There's been all sorts of things offered to them. You know, they'll put up wire fence with gates at the end, high gates. They'll only be open maybe one Sunday a month. Absolutely not. So I don't know how any group can maintain a lighthouse like that if you can't even get to it, and they're not the only ones. There's Patty's Head comes to mind too. They're on the other side of Peggy's Point. So that's why I say I don't know what's gonna happen to the 40 that are, I'm gonna call it in limbo. They're just waiting. Yes?
These national parks have never we take them on as a part of the history of Canada.
Well, there are some lighthouses that are part of Parks Canada. I guess the Louisbourg Lighthouse would be part of Parks Canada.
And I saw it last year, it was in a terrible condition.
Well, they're redoing it right now. They got, what is it, 1.4
It's
million?
not a full ownership, it's still us.
No, I know, it's not under, it's still government ownership.
We own the grounds, but not the lighthouse.
Okay.
So still the Coast Guard is responsible for it.
Yeah, but it seems to me some politician out there, some MP, managed to get some funding for it.
I think it's done now too.
You think it's done,
I think it's
Howard?
done, and it looks quite good, the pictures that I've seen.
Okay,
I've worked for Parks Canada, they're also extremely under-resourced for the buildings we have, so it's always come to really, when those cases come, we can't even take care of what we already have, you know, so it's a very challenging thing.
that's part of the, I would say 80% of the reasons when, the divestiture law came in 2000. They decided to ask local groups to do it, because local groups are invested in it. It's their history. You know, you may have a lot of the population who were related to generations of lightkeepers, and so they feel that they're the ones who look after it the best. but there are some that it's, how can I say, like a fiberglass tower. It's neat to see. I went to see the Publico Harbor one up close, and it's been just discontinued in the last year in terms of an aid to navigation, but again, who has the skills to, keep a fiberglass tower in good shape? So,
A scaffolding company to sponsor it.
pardon?
A scaffolding company to sponsor it, because they're.
Well, some groups are very creative. Shafner Point, who we sponsored a second sign this year, it's going to be installed in June. They took over that lighthouse from another heritage group, and it was in bad shape. I don't have the photos to show you. You're talking a pepper pot here, so there's 4 beams, and 2 of their beams were completely rotted. You couldn't go above the first landing. You went, goodness, to see, because they had insect damage from, was it the ocean side? Anyways, creative or what? They got Home Hardware to help them. You name the contractors in the area. They put up a great big fence and said, here are our sponsors, here are our contractors. It was, in other words, advertising for you. They had a lot of fundraisers, and they managed to get $75,000 in the space of 10 months. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. Plus there are, I'm gonna be frank, some rich people up in that area that wanted to see that lighthouse survive. And then they did apply to Parks Canada through a funding program. Applying doesn't mean you get it, but they did, and they got another $75,000, and now that thing looks like a brand new lighthouse. And again, they were very quick to put it back together. So,
Yeah, but it's a very interesting point when you brought up that what's the most versatile and maintainable typology is because that lighthouse is traditional structure, right? So
Yes.
they'd never be able to do the same if they had fiberglass or.
concrete, for instance. However, the concrete towers, I don't know, they were looked at in, I think, 2010. I know it, at least in the Halifax Harbor, they were all examined, and concrete buildings, unless there's a leak from the top, can last a long time. They may look terrible, I agree with you, they look pretty shabby, but they will last. And that's all that Coast Guard cares at this point. They're hurting for dollars too, so as long as it works, doesn't care that it doesn't look pretty for the tourists. Yes.
One last question, I don't suppose there's any way that we could bring out a calendar of Nova Scotia lighthouses, because that's quite a revenue generator.
It can be. The problem is, we have members that are doing this on their own, and they have sent one to me, and so I don't feel I should kind of cut into their revenue stream. So, I mean, if you're really interested, I can send you the name of these people, and you can contact them. And
I
it's,
send calendars to New Zealand and Australia,
Mhm.
and they always like the lighthouse ones.
yes, and that's, I have family in New Zealand, and I go every year, and that's entirely different the way they save their lighthouse.
Anybody born after 2000 doesn't use a calendar.
Yeah, but
Pretty close. My kids don't have a calendar in their house. Like, we have one in every room. They don't have a calendar.
But if they were given a calendar.
They go, what am I doing with this? I have a cell phone.
anyways, yes. You've left your name with Kathy, and you probably signed it, so I'll send you by email the names of are you one of our members?
Yes.
Okay, then,
John Walker.
okay, well, I will send you the names of the people that make them, and they're really professional looking. I don't,
Yeah.
see I gave it to you, the one I got from Trevor, was it? I'm not sure. It was you?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well then you two can get together.
The problem with it is the calendars are expensive, like they were expensive for me.
Yeah.
The calendar cost me $27.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
So, I mean, it's been suggested before I should sell them, but you can't sell a calendar that you pay $27 for.
No.
You know, like
Yeah.
No.
What was a calendar cost? I mean, I don't know if they even cost that much at the store, do they?
$20.
Yeah, exactly,
20,
so.
25, 30.
And then after January 1st, they're $10.
Yeah, exactly, that's right.
Yeah.
So that's the issue with that, because I've considered proposing that idea myself, but, I'm sure there's cheaper ways to have them made than the methods I'm going through, but nonetheless, it's gonna have to be a lot cheaper before You know, unless you're making 10,000 calendars.
Yeah.
Then-
Yeah, and then of course, there's the bookkeeping and the sales promotion, and how can I put it, I'm not just involved in this society, certainly administrative, but I belong as a member like you are to others. And yeah, they have promoted gear of their own, and it's a lot of work for volunteers to keep it up, and this is part of our problem. Like I said, we're without an editor right now, and I had to reach out to the societies I knew to continue our newsletter. Even if we go to e-newsletter, we need somebody who knows the publication form. I don't know that software. I know lots of software, but that's not one of my skill sets. So, like I say, but we've done our best. Like I said, we have this map, and I mean, the first year we sent them out as pads, and we had a lot more than we had this year, because as the prices go up, the less we can afford. We have a budget like everybody else. They disappeared. We just started distributing them in May, I think it was. Finished in early July, and by mid-August, this was 2 years ago, there were none left. So last year, I think there were a little more left. It was in September before they ran out. And let's see, who knows what this season will be like, because with people not going south of the border, are they gonna stay home, or are they gonna go overseas to Europe? I don't know. So there's that, and then as I say, we have our sign. We developed a template for that, so they'll look the same. And then Kathy says she's brought a child's activity book, or I should say a lighthouse activity book. And this is something we wanna spend time on, because it's very nice. We're all here, we all like lighthouses, but look at my hair, I'm not getting any younger. And it's really important to get younger people involved, and that's why we developed this, well, 4 sides. It's an 11 by 17, like this map, folded in half, so it has 4 11 by 8 pages of a coloring page, you know, a maze. How many words can you make out of the word lighthouse? I said, make it in any language. I am bilingual, so I could make it in French and English. And I said, anybody else who speaks another language, just let me know, and I'll post it on our website, because the solutions to some of the puzzles in that thing, we just want younger people to be interested in lighthouses. And if you say out of every 100, there'll be 2 or 3 that actually do continue to like them into their adulthood. Well, that's 2 or 3 we didn't have before, because all these groups, the majority of community groups, they're aging, and they're finding it very hard. Even in New Zealand, where they have a much different system. We were at Akaroa, and beautiful lighthouse. They sold it for $1 in 1980 to the Akaroa community as it was, so it has all the equipment involved in it. You know, the clockwork mechanism to turn the Fresnel lens. It's just beautiful to walk inside, and it's not much bigger than one of our pepper pots. It's made with New Zealand wood though, different wood. But that was the first thing they told me, was that they're in their 60s and they can't seem to get anybody younger interested in keeping this. However, it is bringing dollars into the Akaroa community. You're not talking big group. John, how many people do you think live in Akaroa year round? 1,000?
Yeah, 1,000.
Yeah, so, you know, it's just crazy in the visiting season. So.
And the guys running the lighthouse were so non-knowledgeable that they had no idea what a Fresnel lens was. They'd never heard the term in their lives.
No. They didn't know what order it was either. And I just happened, they had it open, and there's a little brass plaque that said 3rd order dioptic lens. And I said, there's your answer right there. Now, my understanding is New Zealand didn't get them from France, they got them from England, and they were called chase lens. So maybe that was the problem. I've done some research since. But it goes to show you that even the people, because the person who bought it in 1980 was a retired lightkeeper who saw the value of it, but he's long gone. And with him, all the, you know, skill sets that went with it. So, you know, it's, I'm sure it is a common, if I can say complaint or issue, I prefer that. The issue with all heritage buildings, lighthouses and non-lighthouses, is finding local people or enough visitors that are still care to go visit these sites. So like I say, it's going to be interesting, but for sure, we're gonna see a lot of changes in the next 10 years, 10 to 20 years.
Your point about access was very important too, and it also was telling about the people that would take over these lighthouses, like for example, National Parks system. We can't own the lighthouse without owning a helicopter, and that's just the expense of, like, to making that decision right away, for the Coast Guards to have those means of accessing the sites is very different for some
Well,
of the
and for people to
lighthouses.
get to them too,
Yeah.
like, I visited the Gulf of Mexico last year. And I went through a bunch of lighthouses down there, and some of those lighthouses are getting 500,000 visitors a year, because they're accessible and they're really well looked after, because they have the money from the people you know, it's a circle that goes around and round, because they have the visitors and the visitors are paying the admission, they have the money to keep it up, and they had great volunteers there that, you know, knew the history of the lighthouse. Some of them went back through the Civil War and they had relics from the Civil War there, but it was just, the only one, there's a few you could think of. Louisbourg would be one. Peggy's Cove, if it ever went private, I mean, they could do that at Peggy's Cove, because they get hundreds of thousands of people out there every year, but the vast majority of the places in Nova Scotia, I mean, you think of like Point Prim and Victoria Harbor and those kind of places, I mean, they only get a few hundred people a year usually so they don't have the income stream to keep it going.
Well, that was the whole point of lighthouses. They were put in isolated areas where, you know, that kind of guidance was necessary.
That's right.
And that's part of, I've had arguments with other groups about that, you know, they wanna get right up close and touch them and whatnot, and I say, well, in some cases you can, but in a lot of cases you have to view them from, you know, the top of a hill or from across the water. That was just their purpose. They weren't made to be like a community hall, accessible to all. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed the talk. I certainly found it very interesting to research it, because there were patterns of when styles came in. And it's made me look at other provinces to see what they did with theirs. I think we've done, frankly, very well. Maybe not as good as PEI, but I know we've done a lot better than Ontario, because for a province that had a lot of lighthouses there, except in Huron County, where they made a point, they have imperial stone towers. The rest just let them go to rack and ruin, and it's a real shame. That's the way it is.
Denise, on behalf of the board and the members and our guests, we'd like to thank you very, very much for all your knowledge and a great speech.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Jean, for videotaping this. We're going to put it, we have a YouTube channel. We're not very good at posting things like a lot of vloggers do every 2 weeks, but we try to put talks. In fact, we did this talk for the US Lighthouse Society when they came up July 2023. And that was their first thing is, are you putting this online? And I said, well, let me use it a few more times and I'll put it online. And so I'll have to let them know. They can view it now at their leisure. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.